My name is Jim Dubert, and I'm a member of the University Lectures Committee, and I'm privileged tonight to be here to introduce our speaker for this evening. Our speaker started out his involvement in political and social issues, at least in one way, by going to jail during the Second World War when he was a draft resister, even though he could have taken an exemption because he was at the time in seminary, but instead chose to resist the war and has continued his resistance to what he considered bad policies of this government and voicing opposition to bad policies in other governments since that time. And that has led him to be involved in the civil rights movement, to be involved in the Vietnam anti-draft struggle, and to be involved in presently in many issues, including the nuclear power issue, the race issue, and presently to be involved in the new movement to stop the draft from being reinstituted. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the night, Dave Dellinger.
Thank you. Well, it would seem to me that one of the lessons of the 60s was summarized by the New York Times after the 3 Mile Island nuclear power accident. Well, actually, there's a couple of lessons involved in that. First was that 120,000 people showed up in Washington in a protest. It was organized almost spontaneously after that harrowing event. So the first lesson I didn't have in mind at first was that when 120,000 people showed up, the press all over the country said 60,000 people protest nuclear danger. And it made me think of a rally that we had in New York, a regional rally, one of the first fairly large ones, which took place in Central Park in New York. And there are no telephones in Central Park, but there was one on the bandstand from which the speakers spoke. So the press had to come up there and to use the phone there. And I personally heard the reporter for the New York Daily News call in and say, the numbers turn out to be exactly the same. Call in and say 120,000 people turned out today to protest against the war in Vietnam. And on the way home at the end of the rally, the news is very quick, there was the headline, 60,000 protest war. But about a week after the protest in Washington against the 3 Mile Island danger and the danger of other nuclear plants, the Times, in an inside section, summed it up very accurately. It said, the theme was they lied to us about fallout, they lied to us about Vietnam, and they are lying to us now. And now you can bring right up to the present. And I, as any who were at the rally downstairs a moment ago know, that I very much condemn the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But you cannot believe, who knows how much, 3/4 of what you read about it. The State Department has itself announced that it suspended its usual requirements of reliability, and its usual requirements of reliability were not very great. And I think of something that my friend and colleague Abbie Hoffman wrote a little while ago from his personal experience. He says, 2 years ago, I read in several respectable papers about an incident in which a small platoon of Cuban soldiers fighting in Angola entered a village and raped all the young girls. Later, higher-ups in the Cuban military found out about the incident, court-martialed the soldiers, and executed them. Then he goes on to say how shocked and upset he was. And I remember I went through exactly the same thing, and how he got into arguments with some socialists, he says, fellow socialists and anarchists about it. Then he goes on, the reason he wrote this into this magazine, 7 Days, that I helped publish. Last February, I heard a speech by John Stockwell, who had recently resigned as chief of the Angolan task force for the CIA. He described in detail how the incident was fabricated in an African CIA office, fed to local papers, picked up by Agence France-Presse in Europe, passed on to the Associated Press, and from there, all over this country and all over the world. He explained how he dreamed up the execution idea to add further authenticity to the lie. Well, last Sunday, the London Sunday Times reported that the United States Embassy in Kabul, in Afghanistan, had been fabricating stories about the amount of casualties and about Russian actions in Afghanistan. So we get into this dilemma. We don't know what to believe or what not to believe. And some people, as a result, unfortunately, I think, just go whole hog the other way and say, it's all lies. And yet, I think that you can't do that. The people who said, if I could just quickly give one historic example, the people who said that the rumors about Stalin and the slave labor camps and the executions and the purges were false turned out to be wrong. The United States was fabricating some things, was exaggerating, was telling one side of the story, but there was some truth there. So it's a very difficult road that people have to move on. But I think that what you have to learn, what we have to learn, is not to trust the government or its experts, and not to trust political groups who are too glib, too simplistic, and who give us more slogans than thought, even though slogans are necessary sometimes, such as, hell no, we won't go, or hell no, we won't glow, or whatever they are. Now, people have spoken as if the 70s were wasted. And the lesson that I've just mentioned, I think, was available to us without the 70s, perhaps. But it's my belief, from moving around the country a bit and being in touch with groups, that people really were getting their heads together in the 70s much more than it sometimes seemed. And that, as the women's movement taught us, there isn't anything wrong with trying to work out your own sense of who you are, what the universe is like, what your relationship to it is. And one of the faults of the 60s, actually the 60s, you know, went on till about 74. They started in 56 with the Montgomery bus boycott that skyrocketed Martin Luther King to prominence. They went on at least to 74. But one of the problems toward the end of that period was that people felt so desperate about what was happening. I mean, there was a time when 200 GIs were coming home in canvas sacks every week, and when it varied, but anything from 10 to 100 times that many Vietnamese were being killed every week. And people became so desperate and such a sense of frustration and failure and impatience that they did tend to become sloganistic rather than thoughtful. They did tend to suppress thought rather than encourage it. They did become one-dimensional. And it's out of that, I think, as well as just the natural relaxation that has followed every war that I'm familiar with, beginning with World War I. It was out of that, I think, that a lot of the 70s took place, and I think people became overly discouraged, not realizing how many quiet and useful and basic things were at work. Now, one of the things I think back to is the early teach-ins about the Vietnam War. When, like the woman, I don't know how many heard, but high school student, a woman, spoke tonight about a teach-in or assembly they want to have in the draft with speakers from different points of view. That's the way the early teach-ins were about Vietnam. And if you had a question, you asked it and you got an answer. And the basis was laid for what later became a mass movement. That wasn't the only thing. It was people going out into the streets and people committing civil disobedience, burning their draft cards and other more dramatic things too. But still, the teach-ins laid the basis of the understanding that was part of that movement. And I can think with shame of later rallies when somebody from the audience asked a question that showed that she didn't go along with the single correct line, or that she wasn't more revolutionary than thou. And when she was hooted down, or he was hooted down, or called a pig, or something. And I think of one shameful incident in 1972 when we held a counter-inaugural in Washington in a huge circus tent. And up until very recently, the GIs and the vets had not been a significant part of the visible anti-war movement, but they were beginning to become the cutting edge of it. And there was a veteran in the hospital in Washington who was not only badly wounded, but badly disfigured. And it created psychological as well as physical problems. And he let it be known that he wanted to sneak out of the hospital because he wasn't supposed to even go out and come to the rally and speak. And he did, and I happened to be chairing that meeting. And I introduced him with my heart in my mouth because of the courage and the sensitivity of the man. And knowing what he was facing, he was embarrassed for what people would think when they saw him. And what do you suppose happened? After he had been speaking a little while, a chant began. The chant was, "Cut the bullshit out into the streets, cut the bullshit out into the streets." And they tried to cut the meeting short and get us out of there. Now, I tell you that story partly because of the point I already made about the spirit that got sullied. Not as much as they sometimes tell us, and not in as wide a percentage of the movement, but those things were there. But I tell it to you also for another reason. That chant was initiated and led by a small group around a veteran from Chicago, connected with a group called Veterans for Peace. In 1968, before the Democratic National Convention, he served on the executive committee for the planning, the National Mobilization Committee for the protest, the Democratic Convention. Attended all the meetings. He offered Rennie Davis and myself access to bombs to be used there. And we said, "What are you talking about? You know, that's not what we're into. That would just do more harm than good. It's the opposite of what we're trying to do." So he was involved in those two incidents. When I was put on trial, and Rennie Davis and Abby Hoffman, that I just read from, and 5 others, the Chicago 8, in the Chicago conspiracy trial, that gentleman turned up in court to testify against us. He was a member of the FBI, or worked for the FBI. So another lesson from the 60s is really more bitter than the first one I said when I said you can't trust the government, they lie to us. You can't trust the government because they send in infiltrators and COINTELPRO. But the sad thing was that when he initiated and led the chant, cut the bullshit into the streets, and humiliated or tried to humiliate this poor heroic veteran, it was picked up by some other people. He was not isolated. Later, as a matter of fact, by I think I have the year wrong, and that was 69 that took place. And by 72, at the Miami Convention, particularly led by the Vietnam vets of that time, whenever anybody mentioned violence or proposed it, that was considered de facto evidence that he or she was an agent. But the problem is that there was some support, some things were taken up. And also that the movement, what turned out to be this wonderful, grab bag is the word that comes to mind, grab bag of people, diversity of people who came to rallies like the one downstairs, came to meetings like this, came to committee meetings to plan demonstrations. At first, it was a marvelous diversity of people who could debate, could argue, could make different proposals, and sometimes go out and do different things. And that's why it was called the New Left, the whole spirit, that not everybody had to do the same thing, that there wasn't any single correct solution, that there could be experimentation, and there had to be diversity as well as unity, that you could maintain solidarity and unity in the midst of heterogeneity and diversity. But after incidents like the two that I have just mentioned, people began to become suspicious and afraid and have a legitimate paranoia, but it destroyed a lot of those meetings because people would not speak up, people would not expose themselves, and a different kind of spirit was encouraged by that kind of thing. So I think that somehow or other, that's one of the things that we have to face up to, because these have been the days in which I think they fooled themselves and tried to fool us into thinking it was political apathy. And movements like the anti-nuke movement, I could give instances of COINTELPRO type activity that's taken place there, but they were freer of that kind of thing. But these have been like the balmy days, the good days, when hopefully we have been exploring and finding our hearts and our minds and our souls. But now, I think with the degree of emphasis that the government has on trying to develop what they call national unity, on unleashing the CIA again, I don't believe it was ever leashed, but anyway, unleashing the CIA again and the FBI and that kind of thing. That's a problem we're going to have to wrestle with, how to combine openness and honesty with knowing that this kind of thing is going on in our midst. Now, I'll come back to that, maybe another example later. Another thing that we learned in the 60s, and it contributed to some people being thrown off their feet, I think, was actually it's summed up in a line from a poem by Kenneth Patchen, which he wrote actually before World War II, shortly before World War II. He said, "The problem is that they want to get rid of war without getting rid of the causes of war." And there's a tendency to suggest that the early anti-Vietnam War movement was more naive than it actually was. But still, an awful lot of people came into the anti-Vietnam War movement thinking that the Vietnam War was a mistake, that the president hadn't been properly informed, or that we had the wrong president. People came in because they were upset, and thank God they were, by children being napalmed, or pictures of television of huts being torched with cigarette lighters and whole villages being burned. But they thought that America was a country that didn't commit atrocities, that didn't get involved in an aggressive war. They overlooked the history of slavery and what happened to the Indians. And I used to say that what began before the with the colonists, with the Indians, moved across the country, moved down into Puerto Rico and Cuba and Mexico and crossed all the way across the country and through the Philippines and Hawaii and ended up in the 1950s or 60s halfway around the world in Vietnam. But a lot of people didn't, it was a slow, painful lesson. And only gradually did they discover that there was a certain sense in which the war in Vietnam was a logical expression of our economic and political system and the economic and political drives of the country. And Lyndon Johnson, when he thought it wasn't being recorded, said to the GIs at Cam Bay, after congratulating them for their heroism and so forth, he went over there, he said, "The trouble is that there are only 200 million of us, and there are nearly 3 billion of them. And they want what we've got, and we're not going to give it to them." And more recently, along the same lines, Maxwell Taylor, supposedly a liberal, part of the John F. Kennedy group and all the rest, said, "As the leading affluent have power, we may expect to have to fight for our national valuables against envious have-nots." Well, that was a bitter lesson for a lot of people, and I don't mean to oversimplify it now, but to know that that was an important part of why the United States was at war, that that is an important part today of why Jimmy Carter says the Persian Gulf area is a vital interest. I mean, the United States has vital interest there, which we will protect. What is it, 6% of the world's population, and I forget how much of the oil we consume, but it's totally disproportionate. Somebody could, Jim, you might supply, no, 40%, something. It's in that nature. So that, I mean, we've got what they want, and they're trying to get it, not necessarily take it away from us in all cases, but I mean, if it could be shared, if we could develop some kind of approach to economics and power and race, by the way, because that's an important part of it, then we would discover that we didn't need the draft, that we didn't need the rapid deployment force, that we didn't need the military buildup. Well, I think that was one of the reasons that some people got swept off their feet. And one of the thoughts, one of the glib comments that used to be made in the very late 60s and the early 70s was that the early anti-Vietnam War movement was moral, but now we are political, as if somehow or other the two could be separated instead of brought together. As if, and this again was not, I mean, the majority of the people came from solid moral reasons because they were affronted by people killing other people and napalming other people and clinging to what they had and not sharing and all of that kind of thing. But there did develop, and again, you never knew when it was a COINTELPRO agent or when it was somebody who was so embittered by what was going on. But there were times when it was said with scorn, "Oh, well, he's just opposed to napalming children." You know, as if somehow that meant he was naive and unsophisticated and wasn't up to the political tasks of the moment. Well, one of the things that we learned from all of this, I think, was that all of life is connected and that you can't just focus on one thing. And if you focus on one thing, such as the affronts of the napalm and the rest, and then you discover something else, you don't drop the other one. We learned that the whole of the society is connected, maybe not one-to-one, but in terms of the spirit, the values, the motives, the underlying basic attitudes. And I want to say, because I know that there are people here who have been involved in the prison struggle. And I want to tie that in. It's one of the many things I think that were learned in the 60s, partly because so many people went to jail or to prison and found out that it was a different kind of society than they had expected. I want to say that what LBJ said about we've got what they want and we're not going to give it to them can be applied domestically as well as internationally. Anatole France said once, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to beg, to sleep under bridges, and to steal bread." And we, again, part of the educational process I think we all have to go through is that we are confronted with the apparent majesty and impartiality of the law. And in fact, these days, we're confronted with demands that people be put away for life because somehow or other, and it's true, there are too many muggings, there are too many holdups, there are too many assaults. But instead of seeing that basis in economic and political inequality, that class basis, if you will, to crime, and trying to tackle it head on, the perpetrators of certain acts become the victims. I went to Cook County Jail for a month during the Chicago conspiracy trial. Over 90% of the prisoners in Cook County Jail were non-white, were third world people. And I've done a little studying from time to time, and when there was an influx of blacks into New York City, for example, a vast majority of the prisoners were black. Later, when there came a big influx from Puerto Rico and other Spanish locations, there was the proportion of Puerto Ricans went up. Now, I'm going to say this in a condensed way, but you have to conclude that either there's something defective in Puerto Ricans and blacks and other third world people which makes them criminally inclined, or that there is something racist in the society which deprives them of the means of life. Now, Anatole France said the rich as well as the poor are forbidden to beg bread. And the first shock to me when I went to a federal penitentiary as a draft resistor was the number of people that I met who had actually been stealing things like bread and milk for their children. You know, and if you spend a year, 2 years, 3 years I spent, if you spend 3 years with people, you can get to separate the bullshitters from the real ones. And I can tell you there were a lot of people there who had gone out, and in fact, they're the ones that get caught. The professional, really organized crime people are not so apt to, or if they do, they work it out with the judge. Their lawyers do, and so forth. But the other thing in our society which we have to face up to is that people do not live by bread alone. And that we are a society in which people are deluged with advertisements, you know, for the kind of coats, cars, travel to paradise, all of the things that fulfill their life. Again, one time when I spent 10 days in jail in Washington, D.C., where there was no work for anybody. I was lucky. I was there for 10 days, but people were there for months, sometimes just for months, waiting for trial. And there was no work, no activity, but you were gotten up out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, maybe it varies, maybe it was 4:30 there. And you were not allowed to be in your bed or stay in this crowded place. And you went into the recreation room. And the recreation room had one kind of recreation, well, two kinds actually. They did have some cards for a while. But they had a television set. And I sat there surrounded by poor blacks from the area while they held up the wristwatches, the jewelry, the perfume, all of the things of the affluent society. Well, the whole question of crime is, you know, you could spend the whole evening and many evenings on it. But that's a side to it which I think came out as a result of the activity of some people in the 60s. And when they tell you, as they may tell you, if the movement gets serious. It's already gotten serious, I think. Gotten serious on the side of the Rockefellers and the Carters and so forth, but it's also already gotten serious in the students and the young people and the draft age people and others who know what it's like. But when they tell you, again, one of the slogans from the 60s, which was always wrong, I think, that the duty of a revolutionary organizer is to stay out of jail by any means necessary. Or when they told you, as they told me when I went off to the penitentiary the first time, and I must say I half believed them, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't change my position. But that I would be wasting my time in jail and would be debilitated spiritually and politically. And so when they tell you that, remember that if you do go to jail, and you have to be prepared to go to jail. I'm sorry this is so grim, folks, but it's only a touch of the real world, you know, of what they're threatening us with in war and nuclear disaster and all of the rest. But actually, I went from Yale to jail. And I am not one of those who deride a university education. It can mislead you, it can lead you astray, and it should be a hell of a lot better than it is. But I got a lot out of my time at Yale. But I can tell you that I learned more in jail than I learned at Yale, and more things that are more basic to me and that I would not have learned in any other way. And just for one, I'm sorry if it's a slogan-y thing, but just to think about, one of the conclusions I came out of the federal penitentiary with was that there are people who rob from banks and there are people who rob through banks. And the people who rob from banks, if they get caught, go to jail or get killed when the police are catching them. But if you're a banker and rob through the bank, you know, with interest and mortgages and foreclosures and redlining and all of the other things, why, you probably become a civic leader and you may end up, if not you, your children, running for president and having a better crack at it than most people. Well, I guess I want to come back to another example from COINTELPRO, and I hate to say it, but I could go on with examples of this kind for a long time. But one very sad thing that happened to us, one of the saddest things that happened in my life, took place during the Chicago conspiracy trial. One of the defendants was Bobby Seale, the chairman of the Black Panther Party, national chairman of the Black Panther Party. We were charged with having conspired to cross state lines to incite a riot, even though the Presidential Commission had investigated and concluded that it was a police riot. Black Messiah, and that probably had something to do with what happened to Martin Luther. I mean, definitely had something to do with what happened to Martin Luther King. But anyway, because Bobby Seale was already in jail on another charge from which he later was acquitted, we couldn't meet with him. So we met with a young black man by the name of Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party for Illinois. We met with him every day. I mean, this trial went on for 5 months. Well, the incident I'm talking about, he wasn't around that long. But we met with him every day, and at the same time, we were trying to not get into a defensive position. We were continuing struggling against the war and against other injustices. And so Fred Hampton and I shared a lot of platforms together, travel places together, committee meetings, one thing or another. And I want to say something which probably is heretical, but it's the way I feel, and I haven't sorted it all out yet. But I remember being shocked to look at him. He was 18 years old when I first met him. I was saying, my God, this guy is 18 years old. He has the wisdom, the depth of commitment, some kind of understanding. Maybe, and here's the heretical thought, maybe there are some advantages to being disadvantaged. He knows more than my white friends do. I mean, he's coming from somewhere deeper and more basic, and he was really one of the finest human beings that I've ever known. Well, as some of you undoubtedly may know, on December 4th, 1969, about the third month of our trial, Fred Hampton was assassinated by the State Police of Illinois, working in conjunction with the Civil Rights Department of the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And I won't go into all that now, except that it took a while for that to come out because they faked a lot of things. The Panthers were supposed to have opened up on people who were serving a warrant on them. Later it was found out that of 101 shots fired, 99 of them had been going in, and that somebody had at some point fired 2 shots, apparently from inside. But Fred Hampton didn't fire any shots. He was drugged and never woke up. He was killed while he was lying in his bed. Well, the night that Fred Hampton was killed, 3 or 4 in the morning, that night we couldn't get the court to give us a day off for the trial, for mourning, for solidarity. So as soon as the trial was over, we went to the Panther headquarters. Now, this wasn't where he was killed. He was killed in his apartment. But the Panther headquarters had also been raided a little earlier, so all the furniture had been broken up, the mimeograph equipment destroyed, the list seized, all of that kind of thing. So we had to sit on the floor. And I was sitting on the floor. There was a small room facing a black man. Most everybody there was black except for the defendants. And this black man said to me, "Now, Dave, I guess you understand why we have to pick up the gun." And then a little later he said, "You understand why why you, me, Dave, why you have to pick up the gun and why everybody has to pick up the gun." All I could think was that it was one of the saddest moments of my life, that Martin Luther King had been devoted to nonviolence and he'd been killed. And Fred Hampton, partly because of what happened to Martin Luther King, had decided it was necessary to pick up the gun in self-defense. But he was not aggressive. He did not call for civil war or anything. It was purely defensive. And he was dead. That's all I could think about. It didn't seem to me that picking up the gun or not picking up the gun saved you if you were as serious about reform and revolution as these Martin Luther King and Fred Hampton was. Well, about 3 years later, I found out that the man who said, "Now, Dave, you understand why everybody has to pick up the gun," was an FBI agent. He was the security chief for the Black Panther Party, and he was probably the man who put the Seconal in Fred Hampton's coffee so that he never woke up. Well, I'm not sure why well, I guess I know why I'm telling you all that, because it's part of my experience, and it's the truth. And, you know, people have to deal with those things and interpret them and work them out in their own way. But I guess what I want to end for now is by saying that what I said already, that I don't think the 70s were wasted. Sure, a lot of us went astray. I mean, that happened in the 60s, too. It's going to happen in the 80s, too. You know, I mean, life is difficult and complex. And how many scientists just go in and, you know, they have the answer. There is experimentation, there are false paths, there are all kinds of things that happen. But I think that a lot has been learned. I think the movement is richer and more diverse and better prepared now than it was at the beginning of the Vietnam War. I said downstairs that it's my experience, partly from where I've been and partly from telephone conversations and other communications, that there are more protests and more protesters against the draft today and against the military policies than there were in the first 5 years of the Vietnam War. But more important than numbers, I think, is the richness and the diversity. Not that it's all clear or that it's all evolved in, a way that we can say, there's the answer, now we know how it's all going to work out. But the women's movement, life, so is the abused or not, misled or not, what's the word, taken advantage of by charlatans and profiteers, as every movement in our society is, whether it's a political movement or a spiritual movement. But the human potential movement, some of the new psychologies and spiritual searches have taught us also that there's nothing wrong with starting with me. The problem is if you stop there and don't become we. I'm glad that a lot of people are saying, not me, I won't go, when they're called now. But I think that the spirit is beginning to be we. Anyway, Pascal once said that true greatness consists not in the golden mean, which I'll add is generally boring, but true greatness consists of embracing extremes, being able to bring them together. And I think that what lies ahead of us now is not only an upsurge in political militancy of a kind that is absolutely necessary if we're going to survive and if other people are going to survive, but I think that there is also a period in which things that have been thought of as opposites or contradictions can be brought together, will be brought together in some form of new synthesis. And I just mentioned, for instance, the personal and the political. That's become practically a cliche now, although we haven't really spelled it all out and worked it all out. Now I think with the actions of the government, we're learning that if the personal is the political, the other way of saying it is also true. The political is personal. There is no escape. There is nowhere. What was it Joe Louis said? He can run, but he can't hide. Well, we can go inside ourselves, and it's very important to, in my view, but you can't hide from the draft, from the, you may be able not to be drafted, but you can't hide from the society and what it's doing to people. I think that, as I implied earlier, the moral and, what should I call it, the sophisticated political have to be brought together. The moral basis never lost, because after all, that is what creates anti-war movements, for example, or movements of life affirmation, is some sense of who human beings are. Kenneth Patchen, that I quoted before, if I can remember it, had a line once, "This is a man, he is a poor thing, but you are not to kill him." Well, I guess that's kind of a moral insight. You read it all. But no opposition should be made there. The ends do not justify the means become the end. The other thing is the local and the global. I remember after having read, what was it, The Chalk Circle by Solzhenitsyn? I forget, I get them mixed up. But anyway, I read one of his early novels about his experiences in prison. And I was very impressed by it. And about the same time I read him, he said, we should break up the Soviet Union. At the time, I didn't know he had become an anti-communist and had a lot of other ideas which I personally disagree with and think are unsound. But I said, of course, any good communist would say break up the Soviet Union. It's too big, too centralized, too bureaucratic, too remote from the lives of people. I believe in breaking up the United States. I mean, downstairs, I guess I was introduced as the former chairman of the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. I was. And I and other people used to fly back and forth between the West Coast and the East Coast and sometimes stop in Iowa City or Chicago or Kansas City or somewhere. We couldn't unify the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was only arrogance and having been conditioned by a false centralized society that made us think for a while that somehow or other that was our job. It was much better that there was, yes, collaboration, conferences, discussions, sometimes setting common dates, exchanging ideas, cross-fertilization. But the idea that there should be one national committee to stop the war in Vietnam that would really determine everything, even though it tried to be very democratic in everything. I mean, that's just unwieldy. I wouldn't care if, who shall I say, Martin Luther King, if he were still alive, Fred Hampton, if he were still alive, Lenin, Jesus Christ, the Buddha. I wouldn't care if any one of those persons was foolish enough to want to be president of the United States and be elected. They could not do a good job. And even if they could, there's a difference between having somebody be a benevolent humanitarian who's handling everything from up there, and the growth, the understanding, the human relatedness, all of the things that come from living through your own life. One of the great slogans of the early New Left in the 60s was participatory democracy as against representative democracy. So one of the ways you have to do is to bring together, again, these contradictions in a new synthesis, the local and the global, because the whole planet, you can't separate yourself from it, but we have to have more of what Paul Goodman called the face-to-face community, where people are accountable to one another and to themselves and develop in a totally different way than you can do in New York City, or if you can do if you're trying to run the country from Washington. In the 60s or thereabouts, people used to say to me, what do you believe in, local actions or national actions? And there was an artificial political conflict between those who favored local actions and those who favored national actions. I used to say that's like asking me whether I believe in breathing in or breathing out. If you don't do both, you're in trouble. I mean, you've got to have the face-to-face community, the down-to-earth relationships, the local initiative, the one-man revolution or the one-person revolution. As a Catholic anarchist, Ammon Hennessy, if you ever get a chance to read his autobiography, A Catholic Anarchist, it's very valuable. He used to say, begins with a one-man revolution. Well, it begins with a one-person revolution, but at the same time, it has to be global. And that, again, is a challenging political task for us. Nobody knows exactly how you do that, what the formulas are, but rather than stick with what we've got or turn it on its side and be a mirror image left of opposition of what we've got, we have to develop ways of doing that. We also have to bring together the nonviolent and the aggressive. I don't exactly know what the word to use opposite nonviolent is. I never speak of nonviolence. By the way, Gandhi never spoke of nonviolence. Nonviolent was always an adjective modifying an active word. Nonviolent truth, force, or something of that kind. Nonviolent resistance, nonviolent action. I like to say force without violence. But an absence of violence is like the crazy idea that there is any virtue in sinlessness. You've got to act, you've got to move, you've got to be dynamic, and in the process you'll make mistakes, and if you want to look at it that way, you will commit, quote, sins, at least things that you don't want to do again, because you learn that they don't work. And nonviolence has to be an active, dynamic force, nonviolent force. It has to be a force for liberation, not a force just for not doing things. It has to be a force for doing things. Why do you think the FBI said to me, now you understand, Dave, why we have to pick up the gun? Because they know how to deal with violence. They choose the weapons then. They choose the arena of conflict, like in a duel. They say, we're going to fight you in violence, and they've got the upper hand there. But when people refuse to fight by their method and develop forceful methods of nonviolence, well, there again, there's a whole kind of experimentation that's been going on for a long time, but there's making progress. And finally, with this I'll conclude, and maybe it's implied in everything I said, you have to bring together the spiritual and the material. And one of the lessons out of the 60s, our growths in the 70s, I think, has been in that direction. Not just the obvious things, the movements from Eastern religion and so forth, but there has developed in many places a more closeness with the Native American culture, for instance, more understanding of the roots in black traditions and of various what shall I say, the non-developed, non-imperialist cultures. And I think of, and it's also come very much out of the ecology movement, a closer to nature, that we're part of a universe and it's not our job to rape that universe, to conquer that universe, to dominate that universe, but it's part of our job to become part of it. And I think of this from the Iroquois. You could get a similar thing from many Native American groups. The people who are living on this planet need to break with the narrow concept of human liberation and begin to see liberation as something which needs to be extended to the whole of the natural world. What is needed is the liberation of all the things that support life, the air, the waters, the trees, all the things which support the sacred web of life. You didn't hear a lot of talk about the sacred web of life in the 60s. You had a marvelous development of the Catholic left, the Protestant left, the religious left, clergy and laity concerned, that kind of thing. But in the mainstream, you didn't have calls for political revolution and for sensitivity to the sacred web of life. But I think that that's where we're at now. All right, I'm going to end with a story, as a matter of fact. I hope this is, well, it's been pretty grim, some of it maybe, if you take it. There was a man who was out hiking in the high Sierras. It was such a beautiful day that he just got carried away by it, got blessed out, as they say. And so he didn't notice, and he tripped on something, and all of a sudden he found he was hanging over a cliff. He looked down, and it was over 1,000 feet down there, and he tried to pull himself up, and it seemed a little shaky. He was really in a terrible predicament. So it was this beautiful cloudless day, and he looked up and he called. He said, "Is there anyone up there?" And to his amazement, suddenly there was a thundercloud there. A clap of thunder and a bolt of lightning, and a voice came out of the cloud and said, "Do you believe, my son?" He said, "Yes, yes, I believe." Then there was a long pause, and he began to get nervous. He kept looking up there. And then there was another voice, another thunder and lightning, and the voice said, "Do you have faith, my son?" He said, "Yes, yes, I have faith." Let go. And in a minute, he was saying, "Is there anyone else up there?" I want to say one thing. I wanted to add one sentence to that story. There is nobody up there or out there who's going to do it for us. It's up to us to do it ourselves, beginning with the me generation, or beginning with me and becoming we. Thank you.
Okay, Dave has given us a lot of thoughts and ideas, and he's going to allow some time to ask some questions. And also, after a short question period, there's going to be an open reception over at the basement of the Catholic Student Center to further question and further get to talk to Dave personally. And he's going to also share a little bit more about some of his thoughts on prisons over at the reception too. So we're open for questions.